Picture this. The year is 1987, and a bombshell is about to shatter one of history's most carefully crafted public images. Hidden away in private archives for nearly a century, a collection of letters and personal documents is finally seeing the light of day. These aren't just any documents. They belong to Albert Einstein, the wild-haired genius we've all come to revere as the gentle humanitarian physicist who unlocked the secrets of the universe. But what these papers reveal will shock you. The Einstein you think you know, the pacifist, the civil rights advocate, the wise sage with penetrating eyes, that Einstein was largely a myth, a carefully constructed public persona designed to hide a man whose private thoughts and actions were often cruel, racist, and deeply disturbing. For decades, Einstein's inner circle went to extraordinary lengths to suppress these revelations. His own son wanted to publish the truth, but was threatened with legal action by Einstein's secretary and close friend. They knew that if the world discovered what Einstein was really like behind closed doors, it would destroy the legend they had spent years building. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on one of history's most protected reputations. We're going to examine the shocking evidence that reveals Einstein's treatment of his wives, his abandonment of his mentally ill son, his racist views toward entire ethnic groups, and the profound regret that haunted him over his role in creating the atomic bomb. This isn't about tearing down a hero. It's about understanding the complex reality of a man whose genius coexisted with deeply troubling character flaws. What you're about to discover will forever change how you see Albert Einstein. Because the truth is, even our greatest heroes have a dark side, and Einstein's might be darker than you ever imagined. Let's start with perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Einstein's character, his treatment of the women in his life. When we think of Einstein, we often picture a lovable, absent-minded professor, so focused on unraveling the mysteries of physics that he simply forgot about mundane domestic concerns. But the reality was far more sinister. Einstein's first marriage to Mileva Marić began as what seemed like an equal intellectual partnership. Both were brilliant physics students at the prestigious Swiss Federal Polytechnic, and Marić was one of the few women studying physics at the time. She was smart, ambitious, and some historians argue she may have contributed more to Einstein's early work than history has acknowledged. Their early love letters show a young Einstein who seemed to respect her mind and her potential. But that respectful partnership quickly transformed into something much darker. As their marriage progressed, Einstein began displaying patterns of behavior that would be recognized today as emotional abuse and manipulation. He became controlling, demanding, and increasingly dismissive of his wife's own intellectual capabilities. The transformation was so complete that it's difficult to reconcile the loving young man from their early correspondence with the cold, calculating husband he became. The most shocking evidence of Einstein's cruelty toward Mileva came to light in those suppressed documents from 1987. When their marriage was falling apart and Mileva was reluctant to agree to a divorce, Einstein didn't try to work things out or seek counseling. Instead, he wrote out a list of conditions, a literal contract that Mileva would have to accept if she wanted to remain married to him. This wasn't a list of reasonable requests or attempts at compromise. It was a systematic effort to strip his wife of her dignity and reduce her to the status of a domestic servant. Einstein demanded that Mileva keep his clothes and laundry in perfect order. She was required to serve him 3 meals a day, delivered to his room so he wouldn't have to be bothered with family mealtimes. His bedroom and study were to be kept immaculate at all times, with his desk remaining exclusively for his use. But the psychological cruelty went even deeper. Einstein demanded that Mileva renounce any expectation of personal intimacy with him. She was forbidden from sitting with him or requesting his attention unless he specifically granted permission. If he told her to stop talking to him, she was required to leave immediately without protest. Essentially, he was demanding that she remain married to him, while accepting that she would be treated as nothing more than hired help in her own home. The systematic nature of these demands reveals a calculated effort to break down his wife's spirit. This wasn't the behavior of an absent-minded genius too focused on physics to notice domestic details. This was deliberate psychological warfare designed to maintain complete control while avoiding the social stigma of divorce. Einstein wanted all the benefits of having a wife, someone to maintain his household, serve his meals, and handle all domestic responsibilities, while giving nothing in return. What makes this even more disturbing is that Einstein knew exactly what he was doing. His scientific mind, so capable of understanding complex physical relationships, was equally capable of understanding the psychological impact of his demands on Mileva. He was systematically destroying her sense of self-worth, while positioning himself as the benevolent party willing to maintain their marriage if she would just be reasonable. The fact that these documents were deliberately suppressed for over 70 years tells us something important about how Einstein's legacy was managed. This wasn't accidental oversight or misplaced paperwork. This was a conscious decision by people who knew that these revelations would fundamentally alter how the world viewed their hero. Einstein's longtime secretary Helen Dukas and his friend Otto Nathan, who became the executor of his estate, went so far as to threaten legal action against Einstein's own son, Hans Albert, when he wanted to publish the letters. Think about that for a moment. Einstein's own son wanted the world to know the truth about his father's character, but the people controlling Einstein's legacy were more concerned with protecting a carefully crafted public image than with historical accuracy. They understood that the gentle humanitarian Einstein was worth more, both financially and culturally, than the complicated, often cruel, real person. This pattern of image management extended far beyond just the letters to Mileva. Throughout Einstein's life and after his death, there was a systematic effort to emphasize his scientific achievements and humanitarian statements, while downplaying or completely hiding evidence of his personal failings. The Einstein we've been taught to admire was as much a creation of public relations as of scientific genius. But the abuse of Mileva was just the beginning. Einstein's treatment of his children reveals another layer of his capacity for emotional cruelty, particularly when it came to his mentally ill son Eduard. When Eduard was diagnosed with schizophrenia at age 20, Einstein's reaction wasn't compassion or determination to help his son, it was horror and rejection. Rather than supporting Eduard through his illness, Einstein had him committed to a psychiatric institution and then essentially abandoned him. While Einstein maintained some correspondence with his son, he never visited Eduard after having him institutionalized. When Einstein fled Nazi Germany in 1933, he left Eduard behind in Switzerland and never saw him again. Think about that. A father who chose never to see his mentally ill son for the final 22 years of his life. This wasn't a case of being prevented from visiting by circumstances beyond his control. Einstein had the resources and opportunity to maintain a relationship with Eduard, but he chose not to. The man who would later become famous for his humanitarian statements and his advocacy for social justice couldn't extend basic compassion to his own suffering child. The pattern becomes even more troubling when you consider Einstein's broader relationships with his children. He admitted to neglecting his older son Hans Albert as well, and his emotional distance from his family was a consistent feature throughout his life. Einstein seemed capable of infinite patience when it came to solving complex physics problems, but had no tolerance for the messy, emotional needs of the people closest to him. This selective empathy reveals something fundamental about Einstein's character. He could feel deep concern for abstract humanitarian causes and write movingly about social justice, but when it came to the actual people in his daily life who needed his care and attention, he was often cold and unavailable. The disconnect between his public statements about human dignity and his private treatment of his own family members is striking and disturbing. What we're seeing emerge is a picture of a man whose intellectual brilliance existed alongside a profound emotional dysfunction. Einstein's scientific achievements were undoubtedly remarkable, but they came at a tremendous cost to the people who loved him and depended on him. The question we have to ask ourselves is whether genius excuses cruelty and whether intellectual achievement can compensate for fundamental failures of human decency. But Einstein's dark side extends far beyond his treatment of his family. As we'll see, his private thoughts about entire ethnic groups reveal racist attitudes that would shock anyone familiar with his later public image as a champion of civil rights. The revelation of Einstein's racist attitudes came from an unexpected source: his own travel diaries from the 1920 seconds. These private journals, written during an extended voyage to Asia and the Middle East with his second wife Elsa, remained hidden from public view for decades. When they were finally published, they revealed a side of Einstein that directly contradicted everything the world thought it knew about his character. In these diaries, Einstein described entire populations in language that can only be characterized as dehumanizing. His observations weren't casual cultural commentary or the innocent musings of a tourist experiencing foreign cultures for the first time. They were systematic, biological assessments that reduced human beings to racial stereotypes and hierarchies. When writing about Chinese people, Einstein used language that strips away their humanity entirely. He described them in terms that suggested they were somehow less evolved, less capable of individual thought and creativity than Europeans. His words reveal a mind that saw the world through a lens of racial superiority, categorizing entire civilizations as inferior, based on nothing more than his superficial observations as a privileged Western visitor. What makes these entries particularly disturbing is their clinical, scientific tone. This wasn't emotional hatred or fear-based prejudice. It was cold, calculated racism dressed up in the language of rational observation. Einstein applied the same analytical approach he used in physics to categorize human beings, and the results reveal a worldview that would later be used to justify some of history's greatest atrocities. The diaries show Einstein expressing concern about demographic changes and population growth among groups he considered inferior. He worried about what he saw as the potential displacement of what he termed more advanced races by those he deemed less evolved. This type of thinking, the idea that human populations can be ranked in a hierarchy of biological worth, was a cornerstone of the scientific racism that would fuel horrific policies in the decades to come. Perhaps most shocking of all, these weren't the private thoughts of a young man who would later outgrow his prejudices. Einstein was already in his 40s when he wrote these entries, a mature scientist at the height of his intellectual powers. These weren't casual mistakes or momentary lapses in judgment. They represented his considered opinions about entire groups of human beings. The editor of these diaries noted that Einstein's descriptions consistently portrayed other peoples as biologically inferior, which is a clear hallmark of racist ideology. But what's particularly troubling is that these views weren't universally held at the time. While racial prejudice was certainly common in the early 20th century, there were contemporary voices advocating for human equality and dignity. Einstein's racism wasn't simply a product of his era, it was a choice. This creates a profound contradiction when we consider Einstein's later evolution into a civil rights advocate. During his years in America, Einstein spoke out against racial segregation and discrimination. He corresponded with civil rights leaders, condemned racism as a disease, and publicly supported efforts to achieve racial equality. The man who had once written dismissively about entire ethnic groups was now positioning himself as a champion of human rights. The question this transformation raises is deeply uncomfortable. Was Einstein's later advocacy genuine, or was it a calculated political position designed to enhance his public image in his adopted country? The timeline suggests that his conversion from private racist to public civil rights supporter coincided with his need to establish himself as a moral authority in American society. There's no way to know for certain what motivated this change, but the dramatic nature of the shift, from expressing racist views in private to championing equality in public, raises questions about the authenticity of his later positions. Did Einstein genuinely undergo a moral awakening that led him to reject his earlier prejudices, or did he simply learn to express more socially acceptable views while maintaining his private biases? The suppression of these diaries for so long suggests that even Einstein's supporters understood how damaging these revelations would be to his reputation. The decision to keep these documents hidden wasn't made by outsiders trying to attack Einstein's legacy. It was made by people who wanted to protect it. They understood that the gentle, humanitarian Einstein was incompatible with the racist Einstein revealed in these pages. But the dark revelations don't stop with racism and family abuse. Perhaps the most consequential of Einstein's moral failings involved his role in the development of atomic weapons, a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life and contribute to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent people. In August 1939, as war clouds gathered over Europe, Einstein signed a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt that would change the course of human history. The letter, actually written by physicist Leo Szilard but bearing Einstein's signature, warned that Nazi Germany might be developing atomic weapons and urged the United States to begin its own nuclear program. Einstein's signature on this document carried enormous weight. His name was already synonymous with the theoretical framework that made atomic energy possible through his famous equation E equals mc squared. When the most famous scientist in the world warned the president about the potential for atomic weapons, it was impossible to ignore. The Einstein-Szilard letter directly led to the creation of the Manhattan Project, the massive secret program that developed the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In a very real sense, Einstein's decision to sign that letter set in motion the events that would bring nuclear weapons into existence and demonstrate their horrific destructive power to the world. What makes this particularly tragic is that Einstein's fears about German atomic weapons turned out to be largely unfounded. While Nazi scientists did conduct some research into nuclear fission, they never came close to developing a working atomic bomb. The threat that motivated Einstein to advocate for American nuclear development was largely imaginary, but the weapons his letter helped create were devastatingly real. The irony runs even deeper when you consider Einstein's personal beliefs. He was a committed pacifist who despised war and violence. The same man who advocated for peaceful solutions to international conflicts had inadvertently become the catalyst for the most destructive weapons in human history. The contradiction between his pacifist ideals and his role in creating atomic weapons created a burden of guilt that would torment him for the rest of his life. Einstein himself recognized the terrible irony of his position. In later interviews and correspondence, he repeatedly expressed profound regret about his decision to sign the letter. He described it as the greatest mistake of his life and said that if he had known the Germans wouldn't succeed in developing atomic weapons, he never would have advocated for the American program. But regret couldn't undo the consequences of his actions. The atomic bombings of Japan killed over 200,000 people, most of them civilians. Countless others suffered from radiation sickness and long-term health effects. The nuclear age that Einstein helped usher in would go on to threaten humanity with the possibility of total annihilation for decades to come. The weight of this responsibility was something Einstein carried until his death. Unlike many of the other scientists involved in the Manhattan Project, who were able to rationalize their participation as necessary for victory in World War II, Einstein's role was more complicated. He hadn't worked directly on bomb development. In fact, he was denied security clearance because of his political views, but his initial advocacy had started the entire process. This created a unique form of moral torture for Einstein. He bore responsibility for initiating the program that created atomic weapons, but he had no control over how those weapons were ultimately used. He had acted from the best of motives, preventing Nazi Germany from gaining a decisive military advantage, but the result was the introduction of weapons of mass destruction into human warfare. The story of Einstein's atomic bomb regret reveals something important about the relationship between scientific knowledge and moral responsibility. Einstein's theoretical work on the nature of matter and energy had made atomic weapons possible in principle, but it was his specific political action, signing the letter to Roosevelt, that helped make them a reality. The distinction between pure scientific research and its practical applications became blurred in ways that would trouble Einstein for the rest of his life. As we examine these various aspects of Einstein's dark side, his cruelty toward his family, his racist attitudes, his role in creating atomic weapons, a pattern emerges. This was a man capable of extraordinary intellectual achievement who seemed to struggle with basic human empathy and moral consistency. But there's one more shocking aspect of Einstein's story that reveals just how far the effort to protect his image extended. The surveillance of Albert Einstein by the FBI represents one of the most absurd chapters in Cold War paranoia, revealing not only the government's willingness to target its most celebrated citizens, but also the lengths to which authorities would go based on nothing more than political suspicion and anti-communist hysteria, starting in the 1930 seconds and continuing until Einstein's death in 1955. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover orchestrated a comprehensive surveillance operation that would eventually produce a file over 1,400 pages long. Hoover was convinced that Einstein posed a threat to national security, describing him as an extreme radical and possible communist sympathizer. But what's truly shocking isn't just that the government spied on Einstein. It's the methods they used and the ridiculous accusations they took seriously. The FBI employed techniques that were clearly illegal and violated Einstein's constitutional rights. They intercepted his mail, tapped his phone calls, and compiled detailed records of his political activities and personal associations. Federal agents followed him, photographed his visitors, and maintained constant surveillance of his Princeton home. This wasn't selective monitoring of specific suspicious activities. This was a comprehensive invasion of privacy targeting a theoretical physicist whose only crime was holding progressive political views. But the most revealing aspect of the FBI's Einstein file isn't the surveillance itself. It's the quality of the information they collected and took seriously. The file is filled with reports from informants that range from the unreliable to the completely deranged. Anonymous tipsters claimed Einstein was developing death rays and mind control devices. One informant alleged that Einstein had created a robot capable of reading human thoughts. When the FBI investigated, they discovered that either the informant or the supposed victim of the mind control device had spent 2 years in a mental institution. Think about the resources that went into investigating these claims. Federal agents actually devoted time and taxpayer money to looking into whether Albert Einstein had invented mind-reading robots. The fact that such obviously fabricated accusations made it into official FBI files demonstrates how anti-communist paranoia had completely corrupted the judgment of law enforcement officials. The absurdity reached even greater heights, with claims about Einstein's involvement in flying saucer technology. Anonymous letters warned the Bureau that communists were behind UFO sightings, and somehow Einstein was implicated in these fantastic conspiracy theories. Other reports alleged that Einstein was working with former Nazi scientists to develop beam weapons, despite the fact that he was a Jewish refugee who had fled Nazi Germany and was well known for his opposition to fascism. Army intelligence had to step in to inform the FBI that not only had none of these alleged weapons projects actually happened, but that such devices would be almost completely ineffective even if they could be built. The military essentially had to explain basic physics to federal investigators who were pursuing science fiction scenarios as if they were legitimate national security threats. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the sources of many of these allegations. The FBI seriously entertained reports from Nazi intelligence operatives who were spreading disinformation as part of psychological warfare campaign. Information that originated from the Nazi Security Service's anti-Semitic propaganda division found its way into official American intelligence files and was treated as credible intelligence about Einstein's activities. The investigation also relied heavily on testimony from mentally ill informants and individuals suffering from various forms of psychological impairment. People with documented histories of schizophrenia and dementia were treated as reliable sources of information about Einstein's supposed communist activities. Anti-Semitic cranks who wrote deranged letters about Jewish conspiracies were given serious consideration by federal investigators. What emerges from this massive surveillance effort is a picture of government agencies so consumed by ideological paranoia that they lost all capacity for rational judgment. The same scientific method that Einstein championed in his research was completely abandoned by the investigators trying to prove he was a security threat. Instead of evidence-based reasoning, they operated on suspicion, prejudice, and political bias. The irony is that while the FBI was wasting enormous resources investigating Einstein's imaginary crimes, they were ignoring real security threats and actual espionage activities. The obsession with Einstein diverted attention and resources from legitimate counterintelligence work. The government's most celebrated scientist was treated as a greater threat than actual foreign agents and domestic terrorists. But the surveillance of Einstein reveals something even more troubling about American society during the Cold War era. This wasn't just about one overzealous FBI director or a few paranoid investigators. The Einstein file shows how quickly democratic institutions can abandon their founding principles when fear and ideology take precedence over constitutional rights and rational judgment. The fact that this surveillance continued for over 2 decades, through multiple presidential administrations and involving numerous government agencies, demonstrates how institutionalized this paranoia had become. Einstein wasn't just being watched by rogue agents. He was the target of a systematic government program that treated intellectual dissent as equivalent to treason. What's particularly chilling is how the surveillance expanded beyond Einstein himself to include his friends, colleagues, and associates. The FBI monitored everyone who visited his home, investigated his correspondence with other scientists, and compiled files on people whose only connection to potential wrongdoing was their friendship with Einstein. This created a climate of fear that extended far beyond Einstein himself, chilling academic freedom and scientific collaboration. The Einstein surveillance file also reveals the extent to which the FBI was willing to manufacture evidence when they couldn't find actual wrongdoing. Agents wrote reports that presented speculation as fact, treated unsubstantiated rumors as confirmed intelligence, and repeatedly made claims about Einstein's activities that had no basis in reality. The file reads more like a work of paranoid fiction than a legitimate law enforcement investigation. Even more disturbing is how long it took for the full extent of this surveillance to become public knowledge. Much of the Einstein file wasn't released until decades after his death, when Freedom of Information Act requests finally forced the government to acknowledge what they had done. The systematic violation of Einstein's rights was covered up for years, hidden from the American people who might have questioned whether this was the kind of behavior they wanted from their government. The release of these files forced Americans to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between security and liberty, between legitimate law enforcement and political persecution. If the government was willing to conduct this kind of surveillance against Einstein, a world-renowned scientist with no connection to any actual crimes, who else might they be watching? What other constitutional rights were being violated in the name of national security? But perhaps the most revealing aspect of the FBI's Einstein investigation is what it tells us about the psychology of power and paranoia. Hoover and his agents couldn't accept that someone as intelligent and influential as Einstein might simply disagree with government policies for legitimate intellectual reasons. They had to believe there was some sinister explanation, some hidden conspiracy that would justify their suspicions. This pattern of thinking, the inability to accept that dissent might be principled rather than subversive, reveals a fundamentally authoritarian mindset. Democratic societies depend on the ability to distinguish between legitimate political opposition and actual threats to security. The Einstein file shows what happens when that distinction breaks down completely. The investigation also demonstrates how institutional momentum can perpetuate obviously flawed policies long after their initial justification has disappeared. Even as it became clear that Einstein posed no security threat whatsoever, the surveillance continued year after year. Bureaucratic inertia and the unwillingness of officials to admit their mistakes kept the investigation alive far longer than any rational analysis could justify. The story of Einstein's FBI file serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing fear to override constitutional principles and rational judgment. It shows how quickly democratic institutions can be corrupted when political ideology takes precedence over evidence and legal protections. Most importantly, it reminds us that even the most celebrated and accomplished individuals are vulnerable to government overreach when paranoia and prejudice replace the rule of law. As we continue to examine Einstein's complex legacy, we must grapple with these multiple contradictions. A man who was simultaneously a victim of government persecution and someone whose private behavior often fell far short of his public image. The surveillance he endured was clearly unjustified and unconstitutional, but it doesn't erase the troubling aspects of his personal character we've already explored. This brings us to one final aspect of Einstein's dark side that ties together many of these themes: his relationship with his second wife Elsa during her final illness, which revealed once again his capacity for emotional coldness even in the face of ultimate human suffering. When Elsa Lewenthal became seriously ill with heart and kidney problems in the mid-1930s, those close to Einstein witnessed perhaps the most chilling display of his emotional detachment. Here was a woman who had stood by him through his rise to international fame, who had managed his household and social obligations, who had endured his numerous affairs with remarkable patience, and yet, when she needed him most, Einstein's response was to retreat even further into his work. While Elsa lay dying, Einstein didn't rush to her bedside or cancel his commitments to care for her. Instead, he threw himself into his scientific research with even greater intensity, treating her illness as an inconvenience that interfered with his intellectual pursuits. Those who observed him during this period were struck by his apparent inability to show basic human compassion towards someone who had shared his life for over 15 years. Einstein's justification for this behavior reveals something deeply disturbing about his psychology. He convinced himself that his scientific work was so important to humanity that personal obligations, even to his dying wife, were secondary concerns. This wasn't the absent-mindedness of a distracted genius. It was a calculated decision to prioritize his own intellectual interests over his wife's suffering. The pattern becomes even more troubling when you consider how Einstein had treated his first wife's medical needs. When Mileva required expensive medical treatment after their separation, she wrote to Einstein pleading for financial help. Despite his growing wealth and international fame, he simply ignored her letters. The woman who had borne his children and supported his early career was left to struggle with serious health problems while he enjoyed celebrity and comfort in America. This selective empathy, the ability to express concern for abstract humanitarian causes while showing callousness toward the actual people in his life, reveals a fundamental disconnect in Einstein's character. He could write movingly about social justice and human dignity in his public statements, but when faced with opportunities to demonstrate those values in his personal relationships, he consistently failed. The contradiction becomes even more stark when you consider Einstein's public image during these same years. As Elsa was dying, Einstein was being celebrated around the world as a wise humanitarian, a moral voice speaking out against injustice and oppression. The same man who couldn't show compassion to his dying wife was being quoted in newspapers as an authority on human values and ethical behavior. This brings us to a crucial question about Einstein's legacy that goes beyond his scientific achievements. How do we reconcile the public figure, the Einstein of inspirational quotes and humanitarian statements, with the private man whose behavior toward those closest to him was often cruel and selfish? The evidence suggests that Einstein's public persona was as carefully constructed as his scientific theories, designed to present an image that bore little resemblance to his actual character. So, what are we left with when we strip away the mythology and examine Einstein's true character? We're confronted with a profound contradiction: a man whose revolutionary understanding of the universe coexisted with a troubling inability to understand basic human decency. The genius who unlocked cosmic secrets couldn't unlock the simple truth that kindness matters more than equations. Einstein's dark side forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about how we construct our heroes and whether intellectual brilliance can excuse moral failures. The documents that emerged in 1987 didn't just reveal hidden letters, they exposed the dangerous myth that genius automatically confers wisdom or virtue. Einstein's legacy reminds us that even our greatest minds are capable of profound cruelty, systematic racism, and emotional brutality. Perhaps most importantly, Einstein's story teaches us to question the carefully curated images we're presented with. For decades, a powerful machinery worked tirelessly to suppress the truth about Einstein's character because they understood that heroes are more valuable than human beings. The sanitized Einstein was worth more culturally and financially than the complicated real person. What do you think? Does knowing the truth about Einstein's dark side diminish his scientific contributions, or does it make us better equipped to separate achievement from character? Let me know in the comments below. And if this video opened your eyes to the complex reality behind one of history's most protected reputations, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about our most celebrated figures.